Hello and welcome to this deep dive conversation. With me to discuss migration in Europe is the Paris-based expert Barbara Joannon. Barbara is an expert on asylum and migration policies in the French and European context. She is currently working as an independent consultant for the French Development Agency. Previously, Barbara was head of EU affairs at Forum réfugiés-Cosi, a French NGO that supports asylum seekers and refugees. A graduate of Lyon's Institute of Political Science, Barbara is a senior fellow of international non-profit organisation Humanity in Action, and I'm delighted to speak with Barbara today. Barbara, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you, Nigel.
So, how did you become interested in migration, Barbara?
So that's a quite long story, but it all started when I was doing my internship in the French embassy in Prague. I was working mainly on human rights violation of Roma population in Czech Republic. And when I came back to France, I wanted to get involved to defend the rights of those people. So I was volunteering for a French NGO that worked with Roma people. And while in Czech Republic, they were mostly Czech citizens, actually. In France, most of them were coming either from EU member states like Romania or Bulgaria, or from non-EU member states. So this is how I started to get concerned about migrants' rights. And then gradually I started to work more on that issue. And I wrote two master theses on the link between migration and development and how migrants can be actually actor of development of both their country of origin and the country of destination.
Now, migration has been described as a crisis since about 2015. We've all seen those images on TV. What's your analysis of the situation now, Barbara?
The crisis word, I mean, what was described as a crisis at that time, to me still remains in the sense that it was not a crisis of refugees or migration. It was a crisis of lack of management, lack of proper reception conditions, a crisis of a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of rights violation. So in that sense, it was a crisis for Europe, and it's still. What the politicians were describing as a crisis is less prevalent as it was before, because the number of people arriving to Europe has decreased significantly compared to 2015 due to the high restrictions to the access of the European territory, closure of borders, more border guards, more coast guards since the creation of the European Border Guards and Coast Guards Agency. So a number of measures, also measures with the EU-Turkey deal in 2016. So I would say that in that sense, the crisis is really less prevalent as it was before. But what we in the more activist sector we consider as a crisis, and even researchers are considering that the migration crisis is not a proper term, and we should rather talk about a European crisis to welcome those people and to respect their rights, is still really huge, and we still have in most European countries really poor reception conditions, and in terms of procedures and in terms of respect of human rights, many concerns, I would say.
The UNHCR has just published a press release which discusses the problem of sexual violence in camps on islands in Greece. What's your advice on how Greece as a single country should deal with this?
I don't think I'm no one to give lessons to Greece, and I think it has been really difficult for the Greek people and for Greece as a country in the middle of a massive economic and financial crisis to deal almost all alone with this, although there were many European fundings and agencies like the European Asylum Support Office that sent many people there to help, and many volunteers from all over Europe and even from abroad who went there to help the Greek people. But all in all, I think Greece and Italy now as well are facing this issue quite alone, I would say. And I think there is a real lack of solidarity within the European Union on that issue. And there are still many tensions between member states on how to deal with this crisis. And I think the negotiations around the revision of the Dublin regulation are, in that sense, really the most obvious example of those differences and those disagreements. So I wouldn't want to judge Greece as a country, although it can be improved, and I think each member state has its own responsibility as well to protect people and so on. But all in all, what is going on in Greece, and in particular on the Greek island, is mainly an EU decision to close the border, the external European border from Greece, and to make sure that nobody is able anymore to come from Turkey, for instance. So I think in that sense it's more a European responsibility, and of course Greece should not close its eyes on this, but I think we are all collectively responsible for that, and Greece shouldn't be blamed all alone.
The UNHCR says that it's an issue of security, of course. Vulnerable people, children, women should be protected. But it's also, they say, it's a function of the overcrowding in these reception centres. And one of the solutions that's being proposed is to speed up the processing of these applications. Give us a sense then, Barbara, of what happens to a migrant, an asylum seeker, a refugee, when he or she arrives at a European reception centre?
Well, what is going on in Greece is really particular compared to what's going on in other European countries. So, for instance, with the EU-Turkey agreement, when a migrant, because he still has no status at that time or no legal name, so when a migrant arrives from Turkey on a Greek island, he's eventually stopped there to assess whether Turkey is a safe country for that person to go back to. That's what the EU-Turkey deal says, that any person arriving to Greece today should be sent back to Turkey for his or her asylum claim to be processed there, because Turkey is considered as a safe third country. Now, there is a possibility if eventually after an appeal, for instance, or if Turkey is not considered safe for that person, that asylum seeker is being transferred from the island to the Greek mainland. And then in Greece, either his or her asylum claim is processed by the Greek authorities, or until recently, and to be honest, I'm not really updated on that situation, so I'm not sure whether people are still being relocated from Greece to other European countries, so apologize for that. I don't really have the update on that. But until October, people were still being relocated from Greece to other EU member states for their claim to be processed there. So Greece is a really particular country in that sense compared to other European member states. But the problem that or the issue, the legal issue that is prevalent in Greece is really that the application of that or the use of that safe third country concept and their negotiations now in the EU for that concept to be widened and to be systematically used by all member states, in particular for countries like Greece, for Turkey, sorry. So this situation could be reproduced and be more like the general way of actually examining claims, meaning they have, before the claim to be registered, they have a sort of assessment of whether that claim is eligible or not to be processed by Europeans. So this is a high concern.
The Commissioner for Human Rights has spoken in the past of the numbers involved. If you compare the number of migrants in Turkey, it vastly outweighs the number of migrants entering into individual EU and Council of Europe member states. If you look at countries like Lebanon, it's even a greater proportion of the population. So from your point of view then, Barbara, is this issue of migration more of a communication issue for European governments, that they're not sure how they should communicate around this?
Yeah, there is definitely not only a communication, but I think really a political issue in the sense that it's really either you have the political courage to face the situation and to say, look, we are a rich nation, we have, compared to our population, far less people than many countries in the developing world. So we should help them and be like, take our share, and also consider that this is also something that has affected us in the past. Like many European nations in the past have also been refugees, and we are today many Europeans to travel and live abroad and work abroad and be ourselves migrants, but we are like expats. We're not considered as migrants. So in that sense, it's quite hypocritical, I would say. And to come back precisely to your question, the communication issue around the migration debate is whether or not you want to please a share of your public opinion that is scared of many issues related to globalization, related to unemployment, related to security, terrorism, and so on, and crystallize those fears around one issue, the one of migration. So to me, it's really where we have the core issue of all the migration debate in Europe. It's using that topic to crystallize all the tensions and all the fears that the European public opinion has nowadays. So it's a question of communication, yes, but before changing the way of communicating, politicians should be convinced that there is another way of doing this, and that it's in the long run more dangerous to use that type of communication around migration and to make migrants scapegoats of all the problems in Europe.
So just on this point, is it helpful in the debate around migration that there still seems to be this confusion, Barbara, on how we should describe these newcomers? There are almost political definitions. There is the sense that some are coming as refugees, some are coming as economic migrants, and some are coming as asylum seekers. When you speak to this issue, do you see all of these newcomers as being refugees? Is that a political understanding that you have, or are you happy to accept the various definitions that are in common currency?
No, I think it's really important to have different definitions and to understand what are the differences, because it's true that there is a legal difference, whatever our opinion on that is. I mean, I personally regret there is no legal, it's not definition, but it's that there is not a more binding documentation or regulation or international treaty around migration. So there are now the global compacts being discussed, but so far the only binding document that exists and that defines a refugee is the Geneva Convention. So we have a legal definition on that. Then I think what before defining people, what is important to understand, I think, is that migration is not something that is either black or white. So there is not like the categories of migrants or the population who migrate are not homogeneous. Like people migrate for very different reasons, and you might have someone who later become a refugee who fled a war-torn country and persecutions and so on, but who then in a second life, I would say, once the person has the refugee status, who move for economic reasons or for finding better employment opportunities or for joining a family member or any kind of reason. So I think the problem with the definitions is that we tend to put people in boxes and consider that if they're in that box, good luck for them, like they're the good people, and if they're not, we should not welcome them, we should not even respect their rights. And I think that's what is, to me, the big problem nowadays with definitions and what we call economic migrants, political refugees, that it has no sense. Like the only definition that exists legally is the one of a refugee, so voila, we have that. But then any migrant is first and foremost a human being, and on that we have many legal binding documents in the international community, many international treaties that protect human rights. And I think this is where we should start with, is protecting migrants' rights as human beings, first and foremost. Then, in terms of how we manage migration and how we deal with those different people, then of course we have to look more precisely into the situation of each of them. But I would be really careful with putting definitions that are too strict and that in the end completely overlook many of the reasons why these people have left. And for instance, if you think about climate change, if you think about epidemic situations that we have still nowadays in many countries, if you think about insecurity that might not be a civil war situation, for example, but general insecurity, lack of proper governance, if you think about corruption, lack of economic opportunities, like everything put together can generate many situations and decisions why people want to migrate in the end.
Does this then mean that we may well have to come up with new categories? I mean, you've made the point that there might be new reasons for people to flee their countries. When you look at the work of futurologists, they say, well, in the future, there could be instability caused as a result of lack of access to water. Or we see the climate change and the impact of desertification in certain parts of Africa. You can see these can be new reasons for people to want to leave their country. How will Europe cope in the future with these sorts of people?
So first, maybe allow me a quick comment on your question. Is I don't think it's new. I think there already it already exists. It already exists. Like there are already people which country are flooded, which country are lacking water, and people are already in a situation of migration due to these reasons. But now, what are we going to do about it? It's a very good question. I think many people and many researchers and politicians and think tanks are starting to really work precisely on that, because it's going to be it can be huge in terms of the number of people on the move. To me, there are two things with this. The first is what if a country disappears, for example? It's the case with the islands in the Pacific. There are many islands that are likely to disappear because of the water going up. That is a critical definition in the sense that a state is constituted by its population, but also by its territory. So what if the population is still there, but there is no territory anymore? We have a risk of people becoming stateless, for example. So this is a separate question, I think, to discuss on how states are going to do to make sure that those populations are protected, either because they will become nationals of another state, or because the existing state will, I don't know, buy a piece of land in another country, or a situation like this. So this is a first issue, I think, that is different to the others. Then, in terms of what are we going to do about the other people, I think, again, we come back to what I was saying before. Whatever the reason why people migrate, we first have to acknowledge their human rights, and in that they're human, and so therefore they have rights, fundamental rights that must be respected. The third point I would like to make on your question is that I think we need a change of paradigm. Now what European states seem to think, or actually would like us to think, is that migration can be stopped and that people can be stopped in their country or in their region, and that this is the way it should happen. But first, it's not possible. Migration is something that has always existed and that has to continue to exist, and people have to have the freedom to move to a certain extent, of course, in a managed way. And the second point is that Europe will need migration and is already needing migration in some countries, not all of them, but the reason why Angela Merkel made such an open statement to Syrian refugees back in 2015 was clearly because she knew realistically that Germany was needing workforce, and that the country would need workforce more and more. So it was a very smart political move for her to make at that time. So in that sense, I think the change of paradigm is really necessary. And coming back to the courage that politicians should have. It also starts with recognizing that migration is just a phenomenon we have to learn to better manage, and in a sense that really respects rights of them, all the people.
I'm going to pick up on, you said so many things there. I'm going to pick up on some of your points later in our conversation. But let me just go back to this issue of political courage. Would it be fair to say that European countries are dealing quite well when there are clear examples of people who are fleeing persecution? So this Geneva Convention understanding of what is a refugee, would it be fair to say that European countries still respect that treaty and the treaty obligations?
Well, it's always a matter of comparison, I guess. So compared to other countries, yes, there are minimum standards that are in most European countries still respected. Deficiencies, so many weaknesses, and also a really worrying trend in the revisions of the current CIS, the Common European Asylum System, that is being revised for a year and a half now, and the process is still ongoing. And the reopening of all the legislative basis of the European asylum system is not a good sign at the moment, and what is being discussed is not really positive. And what I fear is that we are heading to a less protective system, and yes, to a less protecting asylum regime in the end. So I'm not that positive on asylum in Europe, unfortunately. And I would advise people who watch us to look at the website Asylum Information Database if they're looking for information on how the European countries deal with asylum, because it's a really well done, it's a big European project, and it's a really well done website as well that allows you to compare countries on the basis of their asylum procedures or reception conditions, detention situation as well in the country, the content of the protection for refugees, and it's a really well documented website. So if people want to know more on that, it's such a broad topic. I could not mention all of the issues that are at stake in many member states, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I'll definitely link to that in the program notes. Just on the issue then of why Germany let in so many migrants, you said that it was a response to what people are talking about as being a demographic winter that faces Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and many other countries. Would you accept, however, that countries still must have the right to decide who comes in? And that is the reason why the issue of political asylum, and to a greater extent the notion of economic migrants, is so difficult for politicians to deal with?
Yeah, well, as from the moment we don't have, I would say, no borders, as on the basis of the current system, the way it exists, where we have states with defined borders, and amongst their core competencies, they have the sovereign right to decide eventually who comes in or not. Yes, definitely, that's fair to say. Now, I think what they should take into consideration is the fact that that they should, but well, how to phrase that? There is, to me, a really unfair situation whereby if you're born French, you have the right to go almost everywhere in the world. Of course, if you want to settle, for example, in the US or in Canada, you have to apply for visas and you have fees, and you're not 100% sure you're going to have like a green card or any other kind of residence permit in the countries. Fair enough, right? It's but we have so much more access to information, to support, to, I don't know, like I feel there is really here a core inequality around the world on how people can move or not. And in that sense, I think if we want to think on the long run, this is something that all states should bear in mind. And this situation will not prevail for the rest of the world. For example, countries like Senegal, they have conditions the delivery of their visa to the fact that France would agree to deliver visa to their own citizens. So in the sense that, okay, you impose us to have visas to come to your country, then we'll do the same. So then you implement a sort of situations whereby everyone is so much controlling the movement and the mobility of people that no one will move anymore if we go that way. You see what I mean? So I'm personally more in favor of something that is more liberal, I would say, in the sense of having more liberal mobility and people having the mobility to move around, because I think that in the end it would facilitate circular migration as well, and people going to a country, working there for a while, coming back to their country of origin, settling there, starting a business. I think, I don't know, seeing examples around me of people who have worked abroad, but then who will always come back to France to, I don't know, like buy a house or start a business, or you see what I mean? I have this personal conviction that in the end, the freer the people are to move around, the most chances there as well they will come back naturally to their country of origin. And I think what also makes a lot of people stay even irregularly in European countries, sub-Saharan Africans, for example, who are in an irregular situation because their visa expired or their it's because they're staying because they know that if they come back to their country of origin, it will be so difficult to come back again to France or to Italy or whatever other country. So they prefer staying than going back without this possibility to come again if they want, or if the family pressures them to do so. So in the end, it makes things, I think, even more difficult for everyone. So this is my personal conviction. It's not really the mainstream opinion right now, and it's therefore really difficult to work on that basis. But it could open certain reflections on a number of migration policies, I think.
Well, certainly. I think I read a report that said there is an obvious hierarchy of passports. Being born in Europe, being born in the United States is definitely winning the lottery of life, to quote the phrase. But when you talk about liberal mobility, Barbara, or this circular mobility, in order for that to take place, you need to have some kind of level economic and social playing field, and we don't have that. So that leads me to where I want to go now in our conversation, which is what happens to migrants once they're here. Many politicians on all sides of the political argument accept that there are many pull factors in Europe that encourage migrants to come here, particularly economic migrants. From your understanding, do people who are living in the South, the global South, are they aware of the welfare state? Are they aware of the social benefits in Europe, to the extent that they are willing to make these perilous journeys across the Sahara on barely seaworthy boats to get into Europe? Is the welfare state in Europe, the availability of welfare provision, that much of a pull factor?
Well, let me first make a comment on that. Most of sub-Saharan Africans, for example, are staying in Western Africa. Most migrations are actually happening at the regional level. So the number of people arriving to Europe after those terrible and awful journeys through the Mediterranean are actually very few compared to the number of people on the move in Africa itself, or in Asia, for example. So I think in that sense, that's the first thing to say, is that what attracts people first when they move is, like, of course, the perspective that they might have a better economic opportunity or a way to make a living that is more interesting than in their own country. But it first happens at the regional level, and I think that is really crucial to be said first. And if we take again the case of Western Africa, before Libya was completely destabilized by the French intervention back in the days, where Gaddafi was killed and the entire Libyan country fall apart, most sub-Saharan Africans were going to Libya to work, actually, and they only left the country to cross the Mediterranean in a second round because the situation there became awful for them, and they were physically threatened, and we know now what's going on. So just to mention that first before moving onwards in my answer. Then the second thing on whether people are aware or not, I haven't read recent report on perceptions of migrants and why they would like to go to a certain country than another. But the welfare state is clearly not the first thing that comes in people's mind when they choose a country as a destination country in Europe. One of the reasons that is mentioned very often is language. So this is why the UK is UK or France have been preferred in the first place as country of immigration by African people, because Eastern Africa people would go to the UK and Western Africa people would go to France. So language is one reason. Then you have family ties or community ties. So if there is a big diaspora community in one country in Europe, this is also a way for people to decide whether they will go to that country or not. Then what works a lot as a pull factor is, of course, the story you hear from people who came back after they have migrated to Italy or to France and who start building their house, huge house in the village. You're like, wow, so this is how to be living in Europe. And they're like sacrifices you have to make in the end are not that important. And the family pressure is often important as well, is playing a huge push factor for people to leave the country of origin is often really important. So it's not, I mean, I wouldn't say the welfare state is the main thing. And in the end, when you look at figures on how many on the use of public services by migrants compared to, for example, what they pay as taxes, the ratio is like this: taxes and use of public services and welfare states. So no, I wouldn't say this. You have people who are getting visas for medical reasons, to receive a surgery or specific medical treatment that they could not receive in their country of origin. You have people who migrate for that and who get visas for that, so they are allowed to do so. But clearly, this is not the first argument or the first pull.
Because you'll be aware, Barbara, that countries have even taken out adverts in newspapers in countries to say, well, look, if you come here, there isn't, the streets aren't paved with gold, that you will face a very austere reception. Also, one of the points made by right-wing bloggers, let's say, is that migrants, particularly those coming through Turkey, were crossing through Balkans countries and were only interested in going to Sweden, the United Kingdom and to Germany because they were aware that the welfare state provision was more generous. What do you make of that as a perception?
On the first thing, what you were mentioning, that there are adverts being put in local newspapers or billboards in a certain country, and I think there's been a campaign like this in Afghanistan and in a number of African countries as well. I don't know what a government thinks, but it's a matter of trust as well. What do people prefer to trust? What they're being told by their neighbor and by their friends, or what they're being told by the government? Of course, they prefer to trust. And it's also a matter of hope, right? And you prefer to trust what is giving you hope. And in many of their countries, they need that kind of hope, that tomorrow is going to be brighter. So I wouldn't be too confident on those kind of advertisement and campaigns. Then on your second point and what the kind of argument that are being used by the right wing, the first thing I would like to say is, what are we doing? I mean, I moved to Brussels a couple of years ago to work, but I was also highly attracted by Brussels in itself compared to Paris, which I thought was nicer, with really cool people from around the world, and a nicer way of living. Life was cheaper. So, of course, I also put that in the balance for me to choose to go to Brussels compared to Paris at that time. And I think we're all doing this kind of choice. Whatever we are, migrants or not, right? We're always putting things in the balance to choose what we're going to do with our life. So that kind of argument to me is highly populist, obviously, and it works really well, unfortunately. But I don't know, I wouldn't take too much time to counter argument, because I think in an era where we have so many fake news and so many efforts to put in to convince people about that migration is good, that it's something that can bring positive things in our lives, I don't think I would take too much time to try to find the argument that would make people be convinced that again, it's not true. People might actually choose the US or Switzerland because the conditions there are better than in Greece or Italy. But voila, I mean, that's, I think, really human in the end as a kind of decision, and really rational. So I wouldn't take too much time for that.
Okay, well, we're going to come to what happens to migrants once they're here in just a moment. There's just a couple of things. In a previous answer, you said that people can't be stopped from moving. There is a perception that the migration crisis of 2015 was a result of an escalation of instability in the Iraq-Syria conflict. So that if there is peace in that area, in that region, that will slow the number of migrants entering into Western Europe. Secondly, there is a sense also, notwithstanding the problems with Oxfam in Haiti at the moment, but there is a sense that we might be able to use foreign aid to prop up structures in the global south, which will create employment, perhaps deal with some of the climate and environmental difficulties that will encourage people to stay in their home countries. Because, as you and I both know, it is no easy thing to leave your country, to leave behind your network, your family, your friendships. So if we can, if we accept that perhaps the European electorate isn't too favourable towards the idea of the movement of peoples into Western countries for whatever reason, then perhaps we could apply our foreign aid more with greater diligence in these countries of the global south, so that the push factors will be reduced. What do you make of those as arguments, Barbara?
Okay, so that's a lot of things to be discussed. Yes. Very quickly on the first thing you mentioned about the fact that in 2015 the migration crisis was highly linked to the Iraqi and Syrian conflicts. Yes, but the Syrian conflict was already at stake for a number of years already. What happened in 2015 is that international aid in Lebanon, Jordan, decreased, and that many numbers of Syrian refugees living there didn't have anything left. So they started to decide that the country was their own home country was still at war for already 4 years. There was nothing to do in Lebanon because unemployment, because not even something to eat, because UNHCR and other international organizations were decreasing their help, so they had to leave. So this is, I think, something also to bear in mind, is that those people didn't leave Lebanon and Jordan out of the blue like this. There were reasons also at that time why that shift happened. So that's the first point. Then your second question is actually really important, because highly popular at the moment, that we should put more foreign aid into developing countries and helping them to cope with poverty, to cope with unemployment, to cope with all kind of problems, lack of education, and so on and so forth, so that people would stay there. So here I would like to make maybe a couple of points. The first is that people have to know that in the short term, when a country is developing and overcoming a certain threshold of growth and of wealth, there is actually an increase in the number of people living in the country. So it actually, in the short and medium term, increased the number of people migrating. Why is that so? Is that because people get education, so they have information about opportunities in the world, they have more income, so they have the means to travel, to pay for a visa, to pay for a smuggler eventually, or simply to get, I don't know, like a stipend or a scholarship to study abroad. So there is actually an increase in the number of people migrating when you develop a country and you help a country to change maybe categories and not to be a developing country, but maybe an emerging country. Or so you first have that increase. Then, of course, it stabilizes. But it's wrong to say that if you develop a country, then people will stay. Now, where it's important that it's giving people the choice whether or not to migrate. And if they choose to migrate, then it's a fully made choice. And it's not a kind of forced migration or constrained migration. And it's also a more secured migration, because people have more capacities and more networks and more means, financial means, to travel more safely. So this is the second point. Then maybe a third point on that is that what European countries are expecting now with that new idea that development will help to curb migration to Europe is that development takes time. You're not creating hundreds of employment in a year, or you're not completely changing an education system in a year, or you're not eradicating corruption and poor management of public finance, for example, in a year. This takes time. And this is where I think European politicians are first lying to their constituencies, saying that this is the brightest and best solution ever, because it's not new. This kind of debates were already at stake 10 years ago in the European Union. So, and it's no magic solution at all. And the second thing I think is that we here have a big risk of completely making it wrong, like worsening even the situation in some countries, because we will make things fast and we will put a lot of money to see quick results, but without making the proper procedure, without making sure that people are trained and have the capacities to use that money properly, and so on and so forth. So it's a really, really important moment, I think, on foreign aid in particular, and we should really be careful on what we're doing with this, because it's, of course, important that we continue supporting, and we should support them more, countries to develop and people to have brighter future in their home country, and to have really a choice whether or not they want to migrate, and so on and so forth. But the objective behind is really important. We should not make this to curb migration or to stop people moving, because first, it's not going to happen, and second, it could generate so many mistakes in the way things are being done that it will be counterproductive on development itself.
That's a really fascinating point, that foreign aid isn't the silver bullet that many people might wish it to be. One prominent Council of Europe member state leader said that it is difficult to build cohesive societies when migration or immigration is too high. This is one of the key tropes around migration that makes the integration of migrants more difficult. So if we now focus on what happens to migrants once they're here, and from everything you've said in our conversation so far, Barbara, it looks like the trickle of migrants into Europe is likely to maintain, if not increase. How do we change the narrative around migrants? We can no longer count on that post-war familiarity of huge population movements within Europe. That generation has died or is dying. Fortunately for us who live in Western Europe, we don't have memories of conflict and war. So how do we change the narrative around migrants so that they are not seen solely within this context of a burden to be dealt with, or a problem that basically requires a criminal justice solution?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the question of the year, I would say. More seriously, I would like to say I think it's true. Like, the more diversity there is in a society, the more difficult it is to live together. I think we cannot be naive with this. And I love diversity, and I love living with people around me that are really different from me. But it's true that it generates tensions, misunderstanding. People have to adapt to each other, and of course, those who were there before want their rules to apply. And I think in that sense, we should first acknowledge this, and it's, I think, really important to do so. Now, how can we change the narrative? The first thing I think is to look at what is the narrative. So really understanding clearly what people react the best to in terms of arguments. So clearly what you mentioned before, there are too many people, we are invaded, people want to use our welfare system, they're a threat to our labor market, our European values and culture, security. I think these are really important features of the current narrative to be clearly identified, because if you want to change them, then you really have to point clearly at what is at stake. And I mentioned that I remember in November saying that we don't talk enough about Islamophobia in Europe. And I think this is really important because it's also something that is put in parallel to migration, because recent waves of migration have seen more Muslim people amongst migrants and refugees. And I think this is something key to be recognized and to be tackled in the sense of a new form of a specific discrimination that might appear as well and be more prominent than what they are now. So that's the first thing. Then the second step, I think, is to understand, why do people believe this? It's because they're themselves economically and socially insecure. It's because of the public discourse in the media and by politicians. It's because globalization is both exciting but also really frightening and leading to resurgence of many nationalism and conservatism. So those, I think, three things are really important, and they don't work the same way for all the people. This is what is difficult, is that for some part of the public opinion, they will be more influenced by what the media and the politicians said. Some others are more reacting to things linked to their personal, economic and social situation. Others are more working along the line of nationalism, conservatism, and would therefore react differently to a certain narrative. So there might not be one narrative to make people think differently, or at least open their mind to newcomers. Now, the third step, I think, is to make people experience. I think there is only this that really works. Before, I would have said we have to, I think a couple of years ago, I was still convinced that giving facts, giving rational arguments, talking about studies, about research, I was convinced that this would work, like massive campaign and a lot of advocacy, activism, mobilization of citizens, and so on. But I think in the end, what works the best now, and especially considering all the information that this flow and intense flow of information we get, and contradictory information, it's really difficult to get in the end what is the truth, right? And we always believe in what we want to believe. So I don't think that worked really well now. I think what works the best is experience, unfortunately. And it's only when we see people who had so much distrust against migrants and refugees in a small rural area somewhere in middle of France or rural Germany, and they see those people arriving that they don't want to live with. And in the end, after a couple of months of living together, you see really positive things happening. Of course, there are tensions. Of course, there is mistrust in the beginning. Sometimes you have violence. That we cannot close our eyes to. But mostly what I've heard are really positive stories and really beautiful stories of people in the end being completely changed by this experience. And I remember from a personal experience, I often give that example, but when I was still working with the French NGO in 2015, I participated to the opening of a reception centers for migrants being evacuated from Calais, and we were in that rural part of France where people were sending threats to the mayor because he accepted to open that reception centers, and the mayor organized a public hearing with his constituency to say, look, this is what we have, they're going to stay for that long, and what are your concerns? And people were scared that, I don't know, the boys would go out from the center and rape the girls, and that they would attack them, and that they would, rob people and attack them. And there were all kind of fears and fantasy also around what these people would do. And 4 months after, you had more volunteers in that center than the number of people, of migrants. So it was just a crazy story. And when the reception center closed, people actually asked the mayor the year after to reopen the center and to welcome again people being evacuated that time from Paris camps. So beautiful stories like this. And this can only happen when people are confronted with difference, with other people having different cultures, different color, different religion. And I don't think you can make that happen just by the discourse. It also has to come with some sort of personal living experience.
We're going to come to what form that experience, that personal living experience, should take in a moment. But as you speak, Barbara, it's obvious that the media has a huge role in this. In 2015, there were extraordinary images of Germans waiting at train stations with placards which said, "Refugees are welcome." Is it your sense that that spirit is still there when we've had since then Sweden described as the rape country of Europe as a result of what far-right bloggers call rape-fugees? You've also had information around the Cologne sex attacks. We've had all of this tidal wave of negative stories. For example, the rape of a young child by a migrant at a swimming pool. We've had a number of these allegations. What do you need the media to do in order to perhaps create the conditions whereby this essentially negative understanding of migrants and their arrival in Western Europe can be perhaps moved a little bit towards a more generous understanding of why they are coming in many cases?
Well, the problem with the media is that what they are portraying usually on migration, but not only, on all kind of issues, is what will be dramatic, right? What will be intense? What will attract the readers or the YouTuber or whatever? Like they want to create a buzz, right? They want to have more people following them, more people reading them. It's a matter of money, right? That's the logic behind it. So of course, when you talk about migration, you're not gonna make a lot of audience if you talk only about like the positive story of that rural area that had to close a school, but in the end they could keep it open because newcomers were arriving, and that was great because there were many kids and they could reopen the school, right? they're not going to talk about that, or only like a small article somewhere to make things a little brighter in that world. But generally speaking, what you read in the media are mostly terrible stories, like news, right? And I think that's not only for migration. Then on migration, I think the examples you mentioned, I don't think we should hide that. I don't think it's a matter of saying that did not happen. They were not raped in Cologne on New Year's Eve a couple of years ago. I don't think that's the problem. And as all human beings, migrants are human beings, and they're also doing crimes, right? There are also people among them that are, like in any kind of societies, that are not stable, that are violent, that are whatever you want. And moreover, there are people who have experienced terrible stuff, and sometimes you lose a little bit of it. So not to try to find excuses, but still, I think in that sense, they should be considered as any kind of other human beings and other kind of group of population. You have people doing bad things within them. So that's the first thing. Then the second is my problem with the way the media portray migration is that first, okay, they are doing that for all kind of topic as well, but not always telling the truth. That's a problem. And then emphasizing always that buzz effect. And I think that's really what makes migration be so badly portrayed and so wrongly perceived, with those boats overcrowded, and you only see this, and you really have that feeling. And I had it myself, you watch those images and you're like, oh, wow, that's huge. That's a lot of people. And you really have that, even if you don't want to say it like this, but this feeling of it's too many. How are we going to deal with that? Which is wrong in the end, and which doesn't help anyone. Not us as societies, not politicians, not migrants. It doesn't help anyone. So I think here there is a huge responsibility on thinking as well to make on that, on how to talk about issues like migration. I don't think migration is the only one, to be honest. That's my field of expertise, so that's the main one I would like to mention, but I think it's valid for many topics nowadays. And the fact that we have so many information, again, that are flooding to us continuously during our daily life, I think makes media even more responsible for what they are delivering to us in terms of information, images. And on migrations, there could be different ways to approach it, right? You can do training of media, you can do awareness raising, you can do, I don't know, more documentaries or short films on more the daily life of migrants in France, positive stories, or France or other countries, I'm sorry. But I think in the end, it's more general. I think that reflection around media has to include all kind of topics and not only migration, because I think it's really broader than just migration.
The Council of Europe has the Intercultural Cities project, which shows how migrants contribute to the well-being of a city, of a region. And there's been emphasis, you've seen them, I've seen them, these documentaries which show migrants. There's a parliamentarian here at the Council of Europe who I think is of Nigerian origin, who is an MP in Poland. There are other examples of this. When it comes to the media, the argument is that good news stories are just as powerful as bad news stories. It's just that there are fewer of them. There aren't so many stories of migrants coming into Europe and founding businesses that go on to employ tens and tens of fellow countrymen. There just aren't so many of these stories, or migrant children going on to win awards. And that all it takes is 1, 2, 3 of these stories which involve terrible crimes to tilt the narrative back again towards the negative. So let's talk about the point that you made regarding the experience. One of the things that you mentioned in our conversation at the World Forum for Democracy was this emerging idea about the private sponsorship of refugees. Talk me through that, Barbara.
Yes, sure. So private sponsorship of refugees is actually a kind of a public-private partnership between national authorities and private individuals or organizations. So they're very different form of them. Very different. Not many of them, but still, there is like not a single definition on what is behind concretely in terms of programs. But the general idea is that a group of citizens or an organization will sponsor financially, but also like emotional support and so on, will sponsor a refugee or family to settle in their community. For that, the national authorities are delivering the visas to allow the people to travel safely from the country where they were first settled, their first country of asylum, as we name that. And the idea is then for the group of individuals or the organization to support the refugee or the family to integrate, basically. So they will help them to get, to find a job, to do all the necessary procedures, legal procedures, administrative procedures, to go to the doctor if they need, to find a house at some point, to get their full autonomy, and so on and so forth, get kids to school. So this is a general process for private sponsorship. Now you have very more precise programs. For example, you have the historical and good practice program is from Canada. You also have a similar program in the US, in Australia. You also have now emerging programs in Europe with, for instance, the UK, Ireland, setting up private sponsorship programs for refugees as well. And you have what we call the humanitarian corridors in France and in Italy. So those humanitarian corridors are actually a little bit different because they're more punctual, I would say. So in the case of Italy and France, it's really the same way of working because it's the same organization that has initiated that. It's called San Egidio Communities, a religious faith-based organization from Italy. So they started first in Italy and then they brought the concept to France. And the idea is that they negotiate with the government a number of visas that the authorities would be eager to deliver. So in the case of France, it was 500 Syrian refugees to be sponsored from, I think it was Lebanon mainly. And in the case of Italy, they're already running their second humanitarian corridors program. And they first had Syrian refugees from various first country of asylum, and now they have opened the program in the second phase to refugees being right now in Ethiopia, I think, and another African first country of asylum. I'm not sure whether it's Kenya or Uganda, but the idea was also to diversify the kind of profiles you would have amongst the refugees being sponsored. Once you have a program that is being kind of set, what is interesting to try to identify is if there are weaknesses or what could be improved. And I think with that concept of private sponsorship, they're doing that pretty well because the Canadians have really taken the lead on that kind of program around the world, and they've set up a sort of initiative whereby they have an ambassador that is promoting the concept, and they're organizing regular meetings for people to discuss how it works in their country, what can be transferred, what should be adapted, and so on and so forth. So it's quite complex in the terms of the administrative procedures because, of course, you have security reasons, you have also a matter of responsibility for the organizations and the individuals that are sponsoring the refugees. So the state has to make sure that those people are actually reliable. They're not making people to come to work for them for free, for example, or like to make sure that there is some sort of security for the country, but also for the refugees themselves. And yes, I think these are the general terms of the programs right now.
So in terms then of the experience, are there other innovative practices or policies that are being employed to make the integration of migrants smoother?
Yes, there are many.
What would be the ones that most excite you?
It's difficult to tell. There are many actually really local initiatives that are being experimented. Not many that are actually initiated by the authorities, I would say. Like, local authorities are doing great things, and they're great partners, I think, for many initiatives. Like, there is a really interesting initiative that has been started or launched by the mayor of Grande-Sainte. He's organizing in early March, so in less than a month, he's organizing a national convention on reception of migrants in France. So it's not an initiative to directly integrate migrants and refugees. So it's not something that is a concrete project or program, but I think it's a political and also a citizen initiative in a sense that is, I think, brilliant and wonderful to see from someone who has a political mandate as a mayor of Grande-Sainte, which is quite like a city that is quite emblematic on the issue of reception of migrants and refugees in France. So I think this is a great and positive initiative. Then more specifically, you have initiatives from many citizens, grassroots organizations, civil society organizations. They're really fruitful in terms of thinking and on how to, from almost nothing in terms of means and capacities, to create bonds with people, to help them, to try to make the best out of the situation. And you have, I don't know, like language courses in the middle of Paris Square in the 18th every night with migrants being gathered in small groups of 10 people and volunteer teachers teaching them French in a public space like this. You have more organized programs for integration that are being run by civil society organizations who are trying to combine access to employment, access to housing, vocational training, teaching of French language, but with the perspective of getting an employment, for example. So, I don't know, you will learn mainly the vocabulary for the specific field you want to work in or you have competencies on, because this is what is the most convenient and practical. But you will not only do that in a regular French course, but through theater class, for example. So you have innovative ways, and I'm sure in all countries in Europe there's so many initiatives like this. It would be good to capitalize on, actually. But what I think is missing is like really good practice from the top. So we have a lot of grassroots and local scales initiatives that are being started and being thought, and where you have many people putting energy in. But I think we lack support, capacities, means from the states, and this is what I think is a little a little problematic right now. Is this kind of gap between what is going on at the political level and what people try to do still on the ground. And you have many universities, for example, doing great stuff. You had that Chiron universities. It started in Germany first, and they have now, from what I know, also a small program in France, whereby refugees in camps can attend MOOC, online courses, to still continue to learn and get degrees, although they are in camps and they're not going to a physical university or school, but they can still keep learning and get involved and have ideas and hope for the future. So all kind of initiative that I could mention in a really disorganized way, and I'm really sorry for that, but they're great stuff. I'm thinking of another one that is, I think, quite interesting because it's involving the private sector, actually. The insurances Generali from Italy, they're huge in the world, right? We all know them, and they have started to partner with civil society organization and social entrepreneurship to support refugee entrepreneurs to start their business in Europe, or to support initiatives and entrepreneurs who want to do something on refugee integration, refugee support, any kind of project around the issue of refugees. And that kind of partnership between firms, companies, businesses that have much money, actually, and civil society organizations that have, or social entrepreneurs that have the skills, the knowledge, the competencies, the network on the ground. Then you put that together and you can do amazing stuff around Europe and around the world. So I know that in particular in think tanks, reflections around Europe, this is something that is clearly being emphasized at the moment. This multiple and multi-actor partnership between the private sector, the public sector, and civil society as a whole to make things work better.
Your points raise the question, how strong is the partnership between civil society and nation states in terms of receiving migrants, helping migrants to settle and to integrate?
I don't know about all the national situations.
In the French context, perhaps.
But in the French, I was about to say, in the French context, there is a lot of distress at the moment. And you might know that there is a new law on asylum and immigration that will be shortly released by the French government. And in the preparation of that legislation, the government has invited several times civil society organizations to meet and to discuss the different points, because of course they need civil society organizations to implement and to run shelters, reception centers, integration programs, and so on and so forth. But you have had many meetings where NGOs have actually left the room or refused to attend the meetings because what they were being asked by the government was simply unacceptable for them, and therefore it creates many tension. And at the moment, I must say that it's really tensed. Yeah, really tensed. For I don't know if you've heard of that, but the example I was referring to, whereby NGOs have left the room, it's because the government was telling them that they would have to actually register the legal situation, the administrative situation of each people they would welcome in emergency shelters, forgetting that emergency shelter is actually like receiving emergency accommodation is actually in the basic fundamental rights of people, whatever their legal situation on the French territory. It's in the law. It's the French government is obliged to provide that minimum standard of emergency reception, emergency accommodation for people, be they French or illegal migrants or refugees, whatever. So when the government asked that to the civil society organizations, they're just left the room, saying we're not the police and we're completely going over our mandate, and our role is to just provide sufficient rights to these people and to help them just meet their basic needs, meaning security, a shelter at night, and that's it. And we're not here to control whether they're legal or illegal, because that's not the place where these kind of things have to happen. So this is currently the context in France, and I think the coming months are going to be really tense as well.
When you look at the legal framework across Europe, do you find that most countries have similar practices when it comes to dealing with migrants? Or are you beginning to see a growing divide between those who perhaps have a tradition of welcoming migrants and those countries which perhaps for political reasons, economic reasons, are taking a harder line?
I think the general trend is really to be more restrictive on those kind of policies as a whole. I have the feeling. I think I've heard recent developments from Ireland, but I'm not sure, that were rather positive. But the general tone is a European tone, and it's really not positive at all.
Could this be because of the perception. Again, this is one of the tropes on right-wing sites, that many migrants, particularly those coming from the Middle East or theatres of conflict there, are going through, perhaps in some cases, or refusing to go to fellow Muslim countries in order to come to Western European countries. And there is a sense that the load, to use that phrase, is not being shared equally. Do you have any intelligence from migrants or migrant rights groups that explains why people who perhaps who are coming from Syria and Iraq, who might be culturally closer to states in the Middle East, don't want to go there, but wish to come to Western European states? Of course, you've mentioned that one of the pull factors is the fact that there may well be family ties, the wish to reunite with family members. But I think it's important, this in terms of perhaps changing the narrative around migrants. I think it's important to discuss what influences the choice of destination countries. So on this point, why are migrants in that region looking to Western Europe and not to fellow Muslim countries?
Well, their priority destination was first Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey. But as I told you, in 2015, they started to have a decrease in the support they were receiving from the international community. And also Lebanon, Jordan, they're not like Germany or Sweden. They're not having the same level of infrastructures, of services to cope with a huge number of people coming in. And they also have, in particular in Lebanon, as you know, intense political issues to solve and security concerns as well. Same for Turkey. It's a particularly complicated country at the moment. So Syrians generally, in the first waves of exile, started to go to Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey at first and foremost, and most of them really wanted to go back to Syria. Syrians in particular are really attached to their country initially, and they were mostly educated people, and Syria was, for the region, was a particularly developed and really stable and wealthy country compared to others. So it's not a question of they don't want to go to Lebanon, Jordan, or Turkey. They went there first for most of them, and then were forced to leave again because there was nothing for them there. And for those who were doctor or who were teachers in Syria, for example, seeing they could not get their kids to school, or they could not give them proper care because the kids were sick and they did not have enough resources or means or support to get them the proper treatment, then of course they want to leave and go to better, well-off countries. So yes, most of them, or not most, because I don't have the proper figures, and there's still many refugees in Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey, but some of them left and started to come to Europe and are still trying to come to Europe. What we know from the few studies that have been conducted on migrants thinking of their migratory road and paths and journeys is often revealing that very few of them have a very clear idea of where they want to go in the first place. Some of them have really clear trajectory because they have families, for example, and usually it's because of family ties or strong community ties from the village of origin or something like this. But if they've not such ties, then the journey is very much influenced also by what they experience throughout the way. And if they arrive in Europe, they arrive in Greece first or in Italy. And what do they see when they arrive in those countries? Very poor reception conditions, a lot of people at the same place, so they have the feeling they will never get through because there's so many that they will never be taken into consideration. Therefore, really long procedures to get anything. And in the end, they say, okay, let's move to the next country. So next country, and then you have people moving with you on the way who says like, yeah, my sister, she's right now in Germany and apparently it's great and they receive a great support from the States and people are really nice and welcoming, we should go there. Or you already speak English, maybe you should go to the UK, it's really easy there to integrate, I've heard. And it's not something that is again, I think with migration we have perception that it's really clear, people want this and they do that because of that, but they're just like us, right? They just adapt to what's going on and what they're being told, and often it's really not a clear from point A to point B in their migration pathway, and it's often like journeys that are just being constructed along the way as well. So again, they're very different kind of situations, and I couldn't give you one single schema to really sum up what their perceptions are about Western countries and so on and so forth. But they're really those different components. So the first country of asylum at some point not being a perspective anymore for them to integrate, them leaving, and then adjusting to what they see and what they experience on the way.
Is it fair that, let me say that again, would you accept that Europeans and governments deserve credit for their generosity towards migrants? Because if we look in other parts of the world, yes, as you've said previously, migration is a fact of life because of insecurity, conflict, climate change, etc. But the migrants going into countries don't always fare as well as the migrants entering into Europe. The best example I can give is that there have been riots in South Africa against the presence of Zimbabwean workers. Elsewhere around the world, you can find eruptions of nationalism when there is a sense that salaries or prices have been affected by the presence of a different ethnic group, for example. So would you be willing to offer that credit to Europeans and governments for the generosity of their welcome so far? Do they deserve credit?
I wouldn't label it around the word generosity. What I think is hopefully we're living on a continent that has a commitment towards human rights and state of law and democracy and a certain form of tolerance and yes, a general appeased continent compared to what it was in the past and compared to what it can be in other part of the world. So I would say the credit is upholding to our values and human rights, respecting human rights. I think this is where Europeans have to prove their best, and I think this is what is driven what you call generosity. I don't think it's a sense of generosity. It's more, hopefully, in the DNA of our continent, we still have those values that are strictly enshrined, and hopefully they will stay like this and not being reduced or challenged more than what they are right now. So indeed. I would say this is the chance we have.
Indeed. On that point then, Barbara, I think we're moving towards the end of our conversation now. What is it that you would like European governments to do that they are not already doing?
I think I kind of mentioned it throughout our conversation, but I think I would really like to see our governments to take courage of acknowledging the current situation and what it will be in the future. And for once, not only seeking their forthcoming re-election and having a little more courage to just tell people, okay, this is what it is. And in the end, they're surrounded by many experts and many people who know what they're telling and what they're doing and what would be the good solution to implement. But they still keep on taking the same political decisions because they want to serve their party personal interests of re-election. Or So this is the first thing to me, and the second thing is truly adopting a right-based approach and not considering people as economic migrants, refugees, but seeing them first as human beings and adopting an approach that is first and foremost respecting those humans as humans, and then considering eventually what kind of legal categories they fall into, what kind of policies apply to them, and so on and so forth. And then the third thing, I think, and I'm really curious to see the negotiations around the global compacts on migration and on refugees. I'm really looking forward states to truly discuss at a more international level, and not only European, but also with their counterparts from developing and emerging countries, how collectively they picture, rule, take decisions and implement policies on migration, because I think it's something quite naive to believe that only France or Europeans can manage this alone and can do their own rules without affecting the rest of the world and of the neighboring regions. I think it's foolish to believe this, and the best way today to have a consistent and comprehensive approach on migration is to really start thinking globally and then apply local solutions. To me, it's really like a political global approach and then concrete, specific local programs, projects, solutions.
I think if when people listen to what you've said during this conversation, you've offered a lot of information. My takeaway would be that you would see migration as something which us as Europeans have to deal with. It's something that will be a feature of the political, social, and economic landscape. And as a result, we have to live up to our European values and have a rights-based approach to migrants. I think that would be a fair summation of some of the key points that you've made.
And maybe one more, sorry, Nigel, one more that I think is really important is to stop thinking migration is a problem to solve. Migration should be perceived and is actually something that can bring positive things in the development of countries of origin, on the evolution of our societies. But for that to be effective, it has to be managed. There has to be a governance framework around migration. It has to be, you see what I mean? Like, I think for me, if I had to say one thing on that, is migration is positive as long as you properly develop your policy around that approach, that paradigm. If you really want to make it work, it's possible, and there's so many positive things that can happen at the political, economic, cultural, social level. But it has to be thought like this first.
Yes, I hear what you say, but I put it to you, Barbara, that there is some cynicism about this understanding that migration is a bonus, and so as a result, it's being sold as a solution to economic problems that lie in wait for Europe as a result of the aging society. However, if you listen to right-wing commentators, they say that again, this is not true. They say artificial intelligence, the increasing automation of the economy, mean that we will not need so many people to be employed in the workforce. And so the notion that we should be bringing in people to do the jobs that are not being done by Europeans, let's say, people born in Europe, is now redundant. It's important, if we are to change the narrative around migration, that we understand what the arguments are of those people who wish to move Europe in a different direction, who want harsher policies towards migrants, who don't wish for them to be received or welcomed in Europe. So what would you say to that specific point, that we are bringing in people to do jobs that we no longer have need of. And so we don't need such numbers to add to the workforce.
Again, like as we discussed earlier, when it comes to right-wing arguments, my concern today, and I told you already, is that I have the feeling that whatever we say on our side of the debate, whatever we say in the end, if people are already convinced, because that's what they want to believe, that we don't need migrants because we have robots, and that's and we're going to have more robots in the future, and that will be enough. What do you want me to say? Like,
do you believe this is polarized?
No, but in the sense that I have the feeling it's often a question of arguments and counter arguments, but it's also two very different narratives in the end, and it's very often difficult to find the argument that will counter that one. Also, because the person who received the message in the end, if he or she is already convinced about one story, today the debate is so polarized, and we have, again, so many fake news and so many. Yes, what I mean. Like, I have the feeling we have a sort of middle of the public opinion that is neither convinced by one argument nor by the other, and this is why I think we have to live up to our own narrative and to our own arguments, and to try to bring them on board with us, because this is what we believe is fair for our society as a whole. But I think, again, when it comes to the right wing, trying to counter any of their argument is so much energy and so much time for, I'm not sure, that many results in the end. And I'm not sure in terms of a communication and advocacy strategy that this is the one I would use as a priority.
All right, then. Well, let me put that to you then. If it's not a question of argument and counter-argument for all the reasons that you've mentioned, let me use marketing and advertising parlance. How do you sell migration to a sceptical European population? And I'll leave you this last word, Barbara.
It's a tough one. It's a very tough one because, again, migration is not homogeneous. And when you say migration to one person, he might immediately think about refugees. Another one will think about illegal migration. Another one will think about diasporas. Another one will. So you see what I mean? Behind the word migration, there's so many images and perceptions of what reality it is for so many different people. So my overall message would be that again, migration is not a problem to solve. It's a phenomenon to be managed, and something that can bring so many positive things to all of us. And again, I'm not limiting that only to Europe, because I believe and that people should at some point be convinced by the facts and figures that time that we are not the continent that is mostly and the most concerned by that issue, or not only concerned by that issue, and that it's something that concerns all of us as a humanity, and I think this should be made really clear. And I have the feeling sometimes Europeans are a bit like auto-centered on themselves, and that, oh my God, this is happening to us, and no one can understand because it's happening to us. But no, it's happening everywhere, and it's not a big deal, and it's not something that will completely destroy all of us. And so again, that idea that it's not a problem to solve, it's a phenomenon to be managed, and something that can bring really positive things to all of us. We want to put that into the perspective of positiveness, and again, really making clear that migrants are no different than us, and we, at some point, all of us in our life, most of us will be migrants. We're just not going to be called like this. And they are not people having like silly strategies, or they're just acting like you and I. So if you want to try to understand why a migrant is doing this or not that, try to put yourself in their shoes and go back to a country where there is nothing left, whatever it's because of war, whatever it's because of drought, whatever it's because of corruption or lack of any kind of future. in there, and then try to make yourself in a position of being a father, a mother with kids you want to see smiling again, or you want to make them go to school or see a doctor at some point. And you know, like, I think it's at some point not talking about them, but talking about us, and putting ourselves into their shoes, and stop thinking they're just like aliens having weird beliefs and strategies to steal our jobs and take our wealth from us. It's not the case.
Barbara Joannon, thank you.
Thank you very much.